So, welcome again to Unity of Strength Zoom calls. This time we have a birthday girl. Her name is Penny ST. So, if you want to, let's give her a round of applause, not just for her birthday, but also for her series, Peace with Penny. She's been very diligent, very serious about making her own peace video and audio podcast called Peace with Penny. And she's really gotten a lot of incredible people on her show, some of whom you might be able to hear about today. Now, Penny has had a long and interesting life, and she's a very accomplished person. And this you will hopefully also hear about tonight on her birthday, which is also the first anniversary of the Peace with Penny podcast, which I hope that you can check out. So I'll start with what were some of the more interesting things that you did before the podcast, before Peace with Penny? What was your life before Peace with Penny? Maybe starting from when you were younger.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you, Rebecca, for inviting me to share my experiences and my podcast and really my life. Well, I was born and raised in Gardena, California, and it probably introduced me to being interested in other cultures. Gardena has a large segment of Japanese people there who live there. And I ended up at Hebrew school because all the kids in the neighborhood, my friends, we would play together and they would go to Japanese school. And the next door neighbor wanted me to be sent to Japanese school with them. And my mother said, no, she needs to go to Hebrew school. So that's how I ended up at Hebrew school. But I did have the opportunity to do things like I danced in the Obonodori festival, and we played Japanese school when we were kids. So I did become acquainted not only with Judaism, but also with the Japanese culture when I was growing up. And in later life, I went to USC. I had really the first, until I was 41 and got married, had an accounting growing background where I went from an accounting clerk to supervision to manager. Ultimately, at one point I had 100 people who worked for me. When I worked for ITT Continental Baking Company, I was very corporate. When I started out as a clerk, interestingly enough, the clerical at ITT Continental Baking, which is Hostess and Wonder Bread and, ding dongs and all that kind of fattening stuff that tastes good. And they were the Teamsters Union, actually. We're a union. And then when I went to be a supervisor, then I was no longer in the union. And we were going through successive system implementations, and I helped with that. And like I said, I had up to 100 people, and I also have worked for Arrowhead Drinking Water, which was later bought by Perrier. And I still, to this day, pretty much drink sparkling water of some type. That's all I drink. And so I guess it had a profound impact on me in a lot of ways. And I did also work for the Los Angeles Times. Interestingly enough, I didn't know I was in the wrong department. I was then too in the accounting department, but who knew that I would grow up to become an author? But I surely did. And I was a manager for them, and they wanted managers to have higher level education. So they came to me and said that they would pay for my MBA if I'd go. So that's exactly what I did. I said, great, fantastic. So I had already gone to USC undergrad, and obviously the Los Angeles Times is located in, or the main facilities in downtown LA. So it made sense for me to go to SC once again for my MBA. So I worked more than full time, and then I'd go to school at night. So I've always worked while going to school. And I graduated with my BS in 1980, and I got my MBA in 1996. And when that happened, then I went and I worked for Deloitte and Touche, consulting firm, part of the Big Eight, and ultimately met my knight in shining armor, and that got married at 41. My family used to, the song "Another One Bites the Dust." they
Yeah.
used to, they used to always sing that because when you live to be 41 years old, you kind of dated a few. So, but got married at 41, and then getting married at that age and wanting to have a child, it would take a bit of effort to do so. And so it took 3.5 years and different doctors. And ultimately, I had to drive every day to San Diego. So I quit so I could do that. And we were thankfully successful. And the boy in the book, who we took him to Israel for his bar mitzvah present, just graduated this year after 3 years, also strangely enough from USC. That was just a coincidence, but with honors. And so there you have it. I guess we're tied to USC. And then I would suppose the major part of my life that I should really go back and talk about my childhood. What I say about my parents is that if they knew better, they would do better. And so there were challenges growing up, and particularly my mother wanted to have a child and did things to be able to have me. My dad never wanted that, and so he wasn't abusive in beating or anything like that, but he did not participate that much with me growing up. And also, my oldest brother my mom had been married before, and he's 13 years older than I am. And so we didn't have that close of a relationship. In fact, when I was young, he ended up going into the service because he and my dad also didn't get along. So he left to get out of town. And then unfortunately, my brother, who was my full brother, it ended up that he was very smart, but unfortunately turned out to be schizophrenic. And with that came abuse of me and all kinds of issues. And unfortunately, he passed away ultimately. But with that, it made me want to figure out, what is this thing called life? And one of his psychologists asked to speak to me, because he went through many, many different people. And that started me on the road of trying to understand. Things didn't necessarily make sense to me. And I've spent my entire life trying to figure out, look at exactly what happened and what should have happened, and hopefully with the thought to prevent that from happening in the future. So I've spent a lot of my life looking at and feeling that people need to look at their lives closely to understand them. And so that was going on as well. In 2013, I started meditating, which I believe is fabulous. I would recommend that to anyone. And a month before we left, our trip was in 2014. I've studied with many different teachers. I believe teachers are incredible. They were really where I got all my kudos, not so much from my family, but teachers all throughout my life were very supportive of me. And I read about, well, actually Oprah Winfrey on her show had many different people that I've studied. I really respect her. She happens to share my birthday, so happy birthday, Oprah.
Nice.
She's a couple years older than I am, but one of the many people she had interviewed several times through the years was someone named Jean Houston. And I had my first class with Jean on finding your life's purpose a month before we went to Israel. And I believe in Israel, I did. And she also, at the time that was my first class with her, I've had 9 classes with her since. And I was thrilled. The last class that I had with her was actually at her house. But in December, bless you, in December of, excuse me, Thanksgiving of 2020, I had sent her a Thanksgiving card, and she wrote back to me that, we were talking about my book, etc. And she said, what's really popular are podcasts. And I thought about it and I said, yeah, you're right. And so it was really Jean's idea for me to have the vodcast. So, of course, thank you, Jean, for so many things, but it was her idea. And that's how Peace with Penny was born. And I have been loving it ever since. But the book was written because in 2014, we went to Israel for my son's bar mitzvah present. Oh, by the way, please interject anytime you you feel that the need.
No, you're doing very well. I think you're really telling the story, answering the questions. So go on. Yeah.
Okay. My husband and I really wanted our son to, it's a very Jewish thing to want your children to identify with Israel and care about Israel. So what's a way that people do that? Well, they take them on a trip to Israel. So this was going to be a trip of a lifetime. We were going to Israel, and we were going then to France and then to England. And it was a 3-week trip. And we 3 weeks before we were going to leave is when they kidnapped the 3 teenage boys, and the Palestinians kidnapped the 3 boys. And 2 days before we left, they found them unfortunately dead. And I was writing to our rabbi and to anyone who would who I could think of, who knows about Israel. Should we still go? Rioting and missiles had started coming. As actually, when we were on the plane, the missiles started. We stopped. We had a 12-hour intentional layover, and we went to Amsterdam, and we went to excuse me, goodness, Lord have mercy. You can tell me. we went to Amsterdam, to Anne Frank's house. Jeez, Lord. Anne Frank's house. And we toured that, and I was reading that on the book, on a book while we were going there. And that obviously is a real heavy story of itself. But anyway, as we were on the plane, and we ended up landing on 4th of July, and I was, feeling bad. We were going to see plenty fireworks. We didn't need fake fireworks. And so we landed. The first week we were there, missiles were coming, and our tour guides told us, don't worry, we won't ever take you into a place where you have to worry about it. And I had been to Israel once before during the first Intifada, and that was true. The tour guides say, we won't take you where things are happening like riots, and it wasn't a problem. However, in this case, they would tell us that, but for instance, that the missiles don't go that far. But then we would move, and then the missiles did go that far. But the first time that it became a problem that we had to run to a bomb shelter, we were actually in Jerusalem, and they had not bombed Jerusalem in 8 years. However, we had just been touring during the day, and the last stop we made was at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum and Memorial, and that was a horrible tearjerker. And we were all exhausted from our various stops. I would say in all of our stops, there was only one that was scheduled that we didn't make, which was we were supposed to go to the Air Force Museum, which is basically a bunch of airplanes outside, and they said that we couldn't go there because they didn't know there was no place to hide if the missiles came, so we didn't go there. But other than that, our tour wasn't interrupted. However, we did end up in bomb shelters, I believe it was 6 times. And the first time, what had happened is, like I was beginning to tell you, we went for the day's tour. Often at night is when the missiles would be shot into various places throughout Israel. But we got back to the hotel and we were going to go to dinner, and my husband, who supports us, needed to go back and do some work. So he went back to the hotel, and I was on the trip with the three of us, my husband and our son, and our, who now is our temple president, but he had grown up, our son had grown up with, who was on the trip with us, his good friend since mommy and me. And my friend, her husband also was supposed to be on the trip, but got delayed at work. And so it was she and her daughter and me and my son, and then another woman from our temple and her daughter, and then the rest of the tour group. But it was just the six of us. We're going to go to dinner, and we stopped in a pharmacy because her daughter needed some supplies. And we walked in, and the kids were at the candy rack, and all of a sudden the pharmacist slammed the front door and locked it and said, "Go to the back, go to the bomb shelter." And we didn't hear the sirens at first. Sirens go off when there's an attack, but we weren't used to it. And in fact, that does happen, where people don't necessarily hear it. But in this case, she was alert and knew what was happening, and we ran to the back of the bomb shelter, and you could feel the percussion of the bombs exploding against your skin. But what it turned out, as was explained to us many times thereafter, it was actually, I don't know if you're familiar with Iron Dome.
Yeah. Iron Dome is the anti-rocket Israeli high-tech defense, where they basically track the rockets and they shoot down the rockets. So I am familiar with Iron Dome, but I'm not sure that everyone watching the video is going to be familiar with Iron Dome.
Yes, that's why I was going to explain it, but you did a great job. I will tell you that each of the batteries of Iron Dome costs $50 million. And then each of the, there's 20 rockets in each of the batteries, and each of those rockets cost $62,000. So it's really, really expensive system to maintain. However, it's very effective, but because it's so expensive, they only go after rockets that are going to land in a populated area. So one of the things that I would look at when we were there is, okay, well, during the entire war, which went on after we were gone too, the war lasted for 50 days, and there were 4,500 Palestinian rockets that were sent into Israel. But only a small portion of those does Israel go after because it's too expensive. So they shoot the rockets and blow up the Palestinian missiles that are going to potentially hurt the population, blow them up in the sky. When you're in the bomb shelter, you're asked to wait 10 minutes. So the shrapnel, what's left, falls to the ground, and you don't get bonked in the head by that either. And one of the reasons that Israel gets such bad press is because, well, there's a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is that and during that war, that there were, unfortunately, regardless of the fact that Israel tries so hard not to harm civilians, because they do, they drop pamphlets, they actually call their homes, they text them and say, at 6 o'clock, we are going to bomb your area, leave. And their leaders, unfortunately, would tell them to stay because they wanted martyrs. They felt there was more value in having martyrs than their people being safe. And so that's what happened repeatedly when we were there. But at any rate, so that's why there aren't so many dead Israelis, because they have this fabulous system called the Iron Dome who protects them. So we, when we were there, and I was getting back to the story, and I panicked, and here we've got bombs exploding and you feel it. And, I'm looking at my son and wondering, oh God, is he going to be safe? And are we all going to be safe? And then I realized my husband was back at the hotel. And I'm wondering, where did he go? What's going on? And so when we were waiting the 10 minutes for the shrapnel to fall down, I quickly called him on my cell phone. I said, where did you go? Where did you go during the bombing? And he said, huh? My husband actually slept through the first bombing that we had gone through.
Whoa.
And, I always joke that he snored loud, but really, I don't know how that happened, but that is a true story. He did sleep through it. And other people later on in the trip, when the early morning from 1:30, when we were in Eilat, and the southern tip of Israel, when things had gotten worse and worse, we were going to go to Petra, so we went to Eilat first, and we were in a bomb shelter at 1:30 a.m., 5:30, I believe, and 6:30. Our other part of our group, they were on, the other people that I talked about who went to the pharmacy with us were on different floors, and one of them, the mother and the daughter, slept through all three. And sometimes I wondered if ignorance was good or bliss or not. You want to go to the bomb shelters because that's where you're going to be most protected. But, it was so scary that there was a positive that they hadn't gone through the terror that we had gone through as well. But that was just part of the strangeness of being in that situation. And like I had mentioned, originally we were told that the missiles wouldn't go that far, and then they did. And eventually, by the time we left Israel, all of the old technology had moved forward, and they were able to send missiles throughout Israel.
Yeah. But you were lucky that it wasn't worse. This was like, happened to have hit Israel in terms of traveling in it during like what ended up being the worst period in more than a decade.
Right. And other strange things also happened. For instance, we went to Petra, the Indiana Jones place that people talk about, and you do quite a lot of walking, and it's 100 degrees and it's very hot, and we saw the ruins, and it was just like on TV, and it was great. And we were walking back, and I got tired and sick of the heat, and a Bedouin offered, there were all kinds of ways that you could go. You could walk, or there were like these little cabs that were offered, and there was this gentleman, and he had a horse, and then he had a colt that was attached to the horse on a rope, was adorable, and offered a ride. And I had enough at that point, and I said, okay, I'm going to go with him, and did so. And that worked out all right. But after we left Petra and we stopped in a restaurant afterwards, and we went to use the restroom, and there was a woman who came in, and she was almost hysterical, and she was, patting her face and trying not to cry. And I asked her if she was okay, and she said, no, I'm not okay. She said, we just got back from Petra, and there was this man, and he had this colt, and and my husband convinced me we should go on it with him, and he had another horse, and with their kid, and because it was so hot and she was so tired, and they did. But rather than leading him back to the entrance of Petra, they took him to a Bedouin village, and they asked him where they were from, and she said Honduras. And then the head of what seemed like the Bedouin tribe to them said something to the person who brought them there, was mad, and then made them motion for them to get in a car, and they drove them back to the entrance of where they should have ended up. And she was firmly convinced that if she had said she was from the US, that she would have been kidnapped. Now, me having just done the same thing, I felt I just had avoided being kidnapped.
Yeah.
So that was another crazy story that happened along the way. But people, for instance, who live in Ashkelon and Ashdod, which is very close to the Gaza border, who very often have to deal with running to bomb shelters and really living in bomb shelters for days at a time when things like this happen. I think really most of the nation of Israel suffers from PTSD, because you can't be under that happening without it. I mean, it impacted me so severely, and I will admit, of the group that I went with, I was the most impacted. And I will say ultimately it was a favorable impact in that what I do today, it made me want to do this. But bombs are really scary, and obviously can be dangerous, and obviously can have death as a result, and injuries, etc. And it's really hard to live with. So we would be in run to a bomb shelter the night that we were in a lot, and we had to go the morning. Well, it was from 1:30 in the morning till early morning, when we had to run to the bomb shelters, and we ran, and there were people from Ashkelon and Ashdod who were there, and a woman was crying, and you see somebody crying, and you say, well, are you okay? You don't know what to say. You say, are you okay? Just, no, I'm not okay. They had driven all the way from there to the southern tip of Israel, Eilat, to try to get away. They couldn't stand it anymore, being a mile or so from Gaza and having the missiles all the time. So they drove to Eilat's, a real beautiful resort on the water. And they tried to get away, and here they were again. They're in Eilat, and they had to rent a bomb shelter. And she just fell apart. And you can't live with this and not be impacted. And yet the countries were, tell Israel not to retaliate, and 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 it's Israel's always trying to um, balance, the international pressure and protecting their citizens. And this is not to say that stuff doesn't happen, but I know I've been there, and I also know when I was there, and I would hear stories such as the PLO paying terrorists to, blow up people, or the bombs, or the balloons, or the different terrorist activities, and that if they blew themselves up, uh, their remaining family would receive salaries the rest of their lives. And the more Jews you killed, the higher your salary. When I was there, I thought, this can't be, our reality here is so different that there's no way that this could be true, I felt. However, when I got home, I checked out all these stories, and it is true. And in fact, a lot of our money that we give from the United States, Europe, etc., for the PLO budget, that's what the money goes for, or building where the rockets come from, the tunnels where the rockets come from, etc. And again, this is not to say that stuff that everything Israel does is right, etc. I know that's not true. And I know that Palestinian parents also want their children to play safely in the backyards. And that's why this whole thing made me want to work on peace. Because I know, I wish I could just, wave a magic wand and say, just stop on both sides. And, Rodney King, can't we all just get along? Because neither side's going away. And they just have to learn to live with each other in some way. And what that ultimately is, I don't know. But I'm very grateful that the people that I work with and the people that I interview, that's exactly what they do. They're Israelis and Palestinians, for the most part, who work together on peace. They realize that that is really the only option. And they're really angels on earth. They face one another's narratives. Palestinians have seen horrible things, and their families have gone through horrible things, and they're put into a horrible situation because of the two sides fighting. And a lot of people on both sides, like people with combatants for peace, many of the people have lost family members, or in family circle, they've lost family members, but realize that fighting each other cannot bring their family members back, and that they need to learn how to live with one another. And I have had the most wonderful year working on Peace with Penny. I should say, obviously, when I got back, when I was there, I was sending out detailed emails to friends and family back home, perhaps from reading Anne Frank's Diary of Anne Frank, and wanting people to know how I was feeling when I was there. So if anything happened to us, they would know. And one of my friends, I have as I mentioned, an MBA, and one of my friends that I got that with had received one of the various emails and suggested to me I should write a book. And when I got home, I thought about it because I really was offended by how Israel was portrayed in the news and still is, that they make Israel out to be this bully who just wants to kill Palestinians. And I had seen and knew that that wasn't true. But I thought people here and really the world, but particularly, I could write a book in English and people would hopefully read it and understand that, this is a complicated mess, that and a lot of what is said on the news is not necessarily true. And I checked out all the stories and I did a lot of research, and because on your itinerary, of course, you've got a couple lines of what you're going to see. Well, that wasn't enough to write a book about, in terms of, I felt like I had to be responsible and know more about where I had visited. So I did all the research on where I had visited, and all of the information was well researched. But I also had to find out how to write a book. I had never written a book. And so it took me 5 years, and it put me through my paces, and I also put it through its paces with professional editors and all that, and ultimately ended up with Blasted from Complacency, a journey from terror to transformation in Israel. So this is the result of that. And I was writing articles along the way as I was writing it, and I would interview people for the various articles that I would write who were working on peace, because that was the impact of the missiles, is that I wanted to work on peace. And so working on peace with Penny is very similar in that the people that I interview, I'm interviewing people. I do pre-interviews, and I come up with questions and then do pre-interviews so I could get even better questions, and then interview them. So one of my beliefs is always that you repeat things over and over again, and you perhaps will reuse them later. And that certainly happened with the vodcast, that I had previously interviewed people and done other things. I'd done, at one point, I had another vodcast, if you will, a webinar called We Are Moms. And because I'm very much into supporting moms as they're raising their children as well. And I also, interviewed people and so on. So I think we all have patterns in our life, and this seems to be a pattern in my life. And I am very happy that we just celebrated our first anniversary, and I'm having the time of my life getting to meet and speak with all these various peacemakers who want peace and who are willing to listen to the other person's narrative. And they work in many, many different ways together. I've had people who, one guy, Leor Eisenberg, he gets people to play chess together. Israelis and Palestinians, and people from the new Abraham Accords as well. And they have chess tournaments, and I've had Professor Mohammed S. Dawoudi, and he's a famous Palestinian professor. And one of the organizations that I've known for years, the first peace activists I ever met was Rabbi Hanan Schlesinger and Ali Abu Awad. Now, Rabbi Schlesinger is an Israeli Orthodox rabbi settler, and his partners, many of them are Palestinian. And they work together on peace in the West Bank. And they have, well, now Ali has moved over to Tagir, which is more of a Palestinian movement, nonviolent movement. But they started and co-founded with also Shaul Judelman, and I've probably interviewed 12 people from their organization. Who work on peace with Israelis and Palestinians from different ways. And there's also people who've worked with them. They don't work for them, but for instance, Saskia Keeley is a Christian woman who lives in Switzerland, and she is a professional photographer, and she has the women, she concentrates on the women, and they take pictures of each other, and that's how they begin to meet each other and know each other and learn each other's narratives. One of the big issues always is the fact that Israelis speak Hebrew, often English as well, but Hebrew, and Palestinians often just speak Arabic. And so they do need to use interpreters. But, thankfully, obviously, on both sides, they have people who also speak English. But that's one of the issues for the whole nation, in that many of these people, they live right next to each other. The village is right next to the town, the Israeli town, the Palestinian village, but they often, Palestinians will work in Israeli villages, but they don't commingle, for instance, after work. And on the Palestinian side, it can be dangerous. There's a whole, obviously, anti-normalization movement that on the Palestinian side, they don't want their people mingling and becoming friendly with Israelis. And, obviously, there's some settlers who also would agree that they don't want Israelis and Palestinians being friendly, but there are thankfully a lot of people who realize nobody's going away and we need to learn to work together. And I think those extreme factions who are able to bridge the gap are incredible. And Rabbi Hanan is one of those, and Ali Abu Awad and other people, and they work together. And it's dangerous. It can be dangerous for them, but God bless them. They believe that's the only way. And none of these people have to agree with everybody. I mean, we see it here today. We don't necessarily agree, politically with folks here. And it's gotten much more contentious over the last few years. But we realize we have to live together, and somehow make it work. And I'm really grateful for all the people that do work on that together. Let me stop myself because I've kind of droned on. Is there something that you'd like to ask?
Okay, thank you. This was very good story. So now we know a lot more about the story and the person behind Peace with Penny. So I would say one more thing. What might you hope to see for this podcast and video cast in, say, 5 years' time? What do you want to see?
I'd like to see it be an accepted, actually. I'd like it as a TV show someday to show people that peace is possible, to show people that there are people who are working together, that peace isn't just a made-up concept, that there actually are people today working together and who want to live together and have their kids play safely in their backyards. I want people to know that I think these are angels on earth who do this, who work on peace together. I don't. If you listen to the news, all you hear about is people killing one another. And unfortunately, that is true. That does happen a lot. But you don't hear about the many people who don't do that. You don't hear about the people who they work together. They have to. It's the way that they feed their families. And I think on the news today, you know, the old expression, if it bleeds, it leads,
Yeah.
is the case. And I get excited about the peace work. I get excited about people being able to live and work together and have productive lives together and not hurt each other.
Yes, like, I mean, the incitement, the violence, these things, they do tend to make the headlines because the ugliest is what does attract attention. But the truth is, nobody's going anywhere. That is, unless one side gets more power than it should and does something really ugly with that power. And so how do you prevent that? Well, one way, as I see it, is to change the paradigm of how the other group is viewed. Think about what might you want to get done that would create a different perspective about the other group. So that's kind of how I like to think about peace building. And with that, I'll kind of leave you with, I'm going to turn off the video recording, keep the event going on for anybody who wants to keep talking, and you will get to talk with this amazing woman if you have signed up for this event, and hope that you can tune in to the future ones. and speak with other people who we invite.